Feel that pause? That wasn't silence. That was gravity shifting. Because when Elon Musk went quiet, the room didn't relax. It stiffened, breath caught, eyes stopped blinking. Not because he's a man, but because men like that don't go silent unless something just recalibrated reality. And you felt it too. You didn't need an explanation. Your nervous system already knew. Something had just crossed a line it wasn't supposed to cross. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. You weren't watching him, they were watching you. You see, silence hits different when it comes from someone who could speak and chooses not to. Noise is cheap. Silence is loaded. Silence means the math finished running. Silence means the answer didn't need a press release. Silence means a conclusion landed so hard it didn't bother asking permission. You've been there. That moment where your mind goes still. Not because you're empty, but because you're done calculating. Where the chaos inside you suddenly snaps into order, and the room mistakes your calm for weakness. They always do. They don't understand that predators go quiet before they move. That surgeons don't scream while cutting. That angels and demons both descend in silence. You learned that the hard way. You learned that pain doesn't just break people, it refines them. That pressure doesn't crush diamonds, it reveals them. That unpredictability isn't chaos when it's mastered, it's leverage. You stopped explaining yourself not because you had nothing to say, but because every word felt unnecessary once you realized the truth. They weren't listening to understand, they were listening to contain. So you did the most dangerous thing possible. You went still. And suddenly the room felt it. Conversations slowed. Jokes died mid-sentence. People checked their phones like they were waiting for instructions that never came. Because silence like that doesn't ask for attention. It commands assessment. It forces everyone else to project their own fears into the void. That's why they panic, because silence is a mirror. And when you stop talking, they start seeing themselves. They see their rehearsed scripts crumble, their little moral costumes slip. Their confidence reveals itself as borrowed. Their certainty starts shaking because it was never rooted, it was rehearsed. Meanwhile, you're standing there calm, unreadable, with that look that says you've already walked this terrain in your head and survived it 10 times. Saint or psychopath, angel or demon, visionary or threat. They can't decide what you are, and that terrifies them more than knowing. You used to think power was loud. You used to think strength announced itself. You used to believe impact came with fireworks and applause. But pain educated you differently. Pain taught you that real power shows up after the noise dies, after the arguments burn out, after the room realizes nobody's steering anymore. That's when silence steps in and takes the wheel. And don't misunderstand, this isn't peace. This is controlled tension. This is what happens when someone evolves past the need to perform. When you stop chasing validation and start letting outcomes speak. When you realize unpredictability isn't reckless if you're the one holding the map. They don't fear your words anymore. They fear what you might already know. They fear that you've seen behind the curtain, that you understand how systems bend, how people fold, how narratives get rewritten. They fear that you're no longer reacting, you're observing. And observation is the first step toward domination in any psychological battlefield. Because the loud ones are still trying to prove something. The quiet ones already understand something. And when someone like Musk goes silent, rooms full of powerful people start rerunning every interaction, every assumption, every underestimated variable. Not because he disappeared, but because they know silence like that means the game just changed phases. That's you now. You don't announce your next move. You let absence do the talking. You let restraint become the warning. You let calm become the threat. They don't know whether to approach you, avoid you, or imitate you. And that confusion gives you space. Space gives you time. Time gives you options. And options are power. You didn't become this by accident. You were forged here. By betrayal. By pressure. By moments where speaking up cost you more than staying quiet. By realizing that being misunderstood is sometimes safer than being exposed. By learning that evolution doesn't always roar, sometimes it withdraws. So when the room goes tense because someone powerful went silent, understand what they're really reacting to. They're reacting to the possibility that the loud era is over. That the calculations are finished, that the next chapter doesn't need witnesses. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to explain. You don't need to raise your voice. Your silence already landed, and somewhere in that room, someone just realized they're no longer ahead of you. They're just waiting to find out how far behind they are. And here's the part that keeps them awake afterward. The part they don't say, even to themselves. Silence like that doesn't belong to people who are lost. It belongs to people who've arrived. When you go quiet now, it's not confusion. It's compression. It's power being folded inward, stored, refined, like a reactor cooling down before the next surge. You're not stalling. You're condensing intent. And everyone in the room can feel the temperature drop, even if they don't know why. That's why they start talking more when you stop. They fill the space with noise, jokes, opinions, virtue signals, bravado. It's panic masquerading as confidence. They're trying to drown out the void you just created, because that void forces one terrifying question into their mind. What does he see that I don't? And that question spreads like a virus, because you've crossed that threshold where explanation feels like charity, where reacting feels beneath you, where unpredictability stops being chaos and starts being strategy. You learn that every word you don't say forces 10 words out of everyone else. Every pause you hold makes them reveal their priorities, their fears, their tells. Pain taught you this. Loss trained you for this. Isolation perfected it. You didn't wake up like this. You were assembled like this. You were the one who tried to be understood first. You were the one who over-explained, over-gave, over-trusted. You were the one who believed clarity would save you. And every time you spoke from the heart, someone used your words as a handle to pull you apart. So you adapted. You learned when to shut the door mid-sentence, when to let silence finish the thought, when to let people sit with the discomfort of not knowing where they stand with you. Because uncertainty destabilizes hierarchies faster than confrontation ever could. This is where the saint and the psychopath shake hands. The saint in you learned restraint. The psychopath in you learned timing. The angel learned mercy. The demon learned leverage. And now you carry both, not as conflict, but as range. That's what they sense. That's why the room changes. They don't know if you're about to build something that leaves them irrelevant, or dismantle something they thought was untouchable. They don't know if your silence means forgiveness or finality. And not knowing is unbearable for people who live off control. You're no longer loud enough to predict. You're no longer emotional enough to provoke. You're no longer reactive enough to manipulate. That scares them more than any threat ever could. Because threats announce intent. Silence suggests completion. When someone like Elon Musk goes quiet, it signals that the argument phase is over, that the persuasion phase failed, that the numbers have already been run, that whatever comes next doesn't require consensus. It requires execution. And they see that same signal in you now. Your stillness carries weight because it's earned. Because you've been to the edges of yourself and didn't flinch. Because you've survived versions of reality that would have shattered the masks they're still wearing. Because you've learned how to be alone without collapsing. And that's a power most people never develop. They mistake your calm for arrogance, your distance for coldness, your silence for detachment. They're wrong. It's focus. You're no longer broadcasting your intentions into hostile territory. You're no longer feeding the algorithm of other people's expectations. You're conserving energy, choosing angles, letting patterns reveal themselves before you move. You've become the variable they can't model. And systems hate unmodelable variables. So they speculate, they whisper, they project, they overanalyze your posture, your timing, your lack of reaction. They start attributing meanings to your silence because they can't stand the idea that you might simply be operating on a level they don't have access to. Which is exactly what's happening. You don't rush anymore. You don't need to. Rushing is for people who think time is against them. You know time bends for those who understand patience as a weapon. You let moments ripen. You let pressure build. You let people underestimate the depth of the water before they step in. And when you finally speak or act, it lands heavier because it's rare. Because silence trained them to listen. That's the paradox. The quieter you become, the louder your presence gets. The less you explain, the more seriously you're taken. The less you react, the more control you hold. It's upside-down logic, and that's why it works. You're not playing the game they prepared for. You're playing the one they forgot to guard against. And deep down, they know it. They know something irreversible happened when you stopped needing their validation, when you stopped chasing clarity from people who benefit from confusion, when you realized that the most dangerous thing in any room isn't the loudest voice. It's the one that's done talking. So let them feel that tension. Let them sit in that silence. Let them wonder what shifted. Because you didn't lose your voice. You outgrew the need to use it. And now the room knows, without a single word, that whatever comes next won't be negotiated, won't be announced, and won't be stopped. That's why it feels bad. That's why it feels final. That's why, when you go silent, the entire room recalibrates around you. And the longer you hold that silence, the more it starts to reprogram the people around you. Because silence like yours doesn't just unsettle a moment, it infects the timeline. Hours later, they're still replaying it. Days later, they're still trying to decode it. Weeks later, they're adjusting their behavior around you without realizing why. They speak more carefully, they pitch softer, they test fewer boundaries, not because you demanded respect, but because your stillness quietly redefined the risk. That's what evolution looks like when it's real. You didn't become quieter because you were defeated. You became quieter because you stopped bleeding in public. You learned that pain doesn't need an audience to do its work, that growth doesn't ask for applause, that the most dangerous transformations happen in places nobody claps for. You used to announce your wounds, now you weaponize your composure. You used to explain your vision, now you let outcomes explain it for you. You used to argue your worth, now your absence from the argument ends it. And this is where the paradox sharpens, because the more disciplined your silence becomes, the more people project power onto you. They start assuming you know things you never claimed to know, that you see angles you never mentioned, that you're holding cards you never showed. And instead of correcting them, you let them. Because you finally understand something most people never do. Perception is leverage. What they think you're capable of controls how they treat you, more than what you're actually doing. And silence is the most efficient way to let fear, respect, and curiosity build without resistance. You're no longer chasing certainty. You're allowing ambiguity to work for you. That's why your presence feels heavier now. That's why rooms change temperature when you enter. It's not ego. It's not dominance. It's not intimidation. It's the unmistakable signal of someone who has integrated their light and their dark instead of letting them fight each other. You don't need to be nice to be moral. You don't need to be ruthless to be strong. You can be both restrained and dangerous, both calm and catastrophic. That duality used to tear you apart. Now it makes you unreadable. And unreadable people don't get played. They get circled. People start checking themselves around you. They wonder if you noticed that slip, that contradiction, that weakness. They start assuming you did. Because someone who can sit comfortably in silence has already faced things far worse than awkward tension. You've stared down your own shadow and didn't blink. That's what scares them. Because most people build their identity on constant reinforcement, on feedback loops, on noise, on reaction. Take that away, and they crumble. You didn't. You adapted. You learned to regulate instead of react, to pause instead of pounce, to wait instead of rush. And now your timing is lethal. You don't move when you're provoked. You move when it's inevitable. You don't speak when you're emotional. You speak when the words can't be ignored. You don't chase momentum. You create gravity. That's why the silence hits so hard. Because it feels like something has already been decided. Like the verdict came down before the trial even started. Like the game continued. But on a board, nobody else can see yet. They sense that you're no longer asking, "What do they think?" You're asking, "When do I act?" And that shift is irreversible. Once you've experienced the power of not needing to be heard, you never go back to shouting. Once you've felt the control of not reacting, you never rush to respond. Once you've watched people unravel simply because you didn't give them access to your inner world, you stop oversharing forever. This is the quiet after the storm. Not peace, but clarity. Clarity about who matters. Clarity about what's worth energy. Clarity about the difference between noise and signal. And you've become all signal. So let them misinterpret you. Let them speculate. Let them invent stories to fill the silence you left behind. Every projection tells you more about them than any confession ever could. You're not hiding. You're positioning. And the truth is, the room didn't go quiet because someone powerful stopped talking. The room went quiet because it recognized the presence of someone who no longer needs to. Someone who's already survived the worst-case scenario in their head. Someone who's already paid the price of becoming this composed. Someone who understands that silence isn't empty, it's loaded. And when you finally decide to break it, it won't be to explain. It'll be to end something. And here's where it settles. You don't need to prove anything anymore. That hunger is gone. That itch to be validated burned out in the fire that made you this precise. Now you move differently. You listen longer. You speak later. You let people expose themselves while trying to read you. And they never quite can. Because you're not silent out of fear. You're silent because you know. You know that real power doesn't rush to the mic. You know that the most dangerous minds don't argue. They decide. You know that when the noise stops, reality starts rearranging itself around whoever can stay calm inside the void. That's you. So let the room tense up. Let the whispers multiply. Let them assume the worst or the best. Either way, they're already adjusting to you and you haven't lifted a finger. Your silence isn't absence, it's authority without announcement. And when you finally do move, it won't be loud. It won't be dramatic. It won't ask permission. It'll feel inevitable. That's why the room went quiet. That's why it felt bad. Because on some level, they knew the conversation was already over. And the strangest part is, you didn't try to become this. This wasn't a persona you put on. This wasn't confidence coaching or fake composure. This was forged, layer by layer, failure by failure, moment by moment, when you realized reacting cost you more than waiting ever could. You remember the old version of you, the one who rushed to clarify, to defend, to correct the narrative before it escaped your control. You thought being understood was survival. You thought transparency was safety. You thought if people just knew your intentions, things would stabilize. That belief died painfully because you learned something brutal and precise. Most people don't want clarity. They want leverage. So you stopped feeding them. You stopped narrating your inner world. You stopped giving spoilers to people who hadn't earned the ending. You stopped mistaking access for intimacy. And the moment you did, everything shifted. Conversations became shorter. Tension became sharper. Respect, real respect, started appearing without being requested. Not admiration, not applause, caution. Caution is honest. People became careful with their words around you. Not because you threatened them, but because you no longer gave them enough data to predict how far you'd go if pushed. They couldn't tell whether you were merciful or merciless, forgiving or finished, patient or already done. That uncertainty unsettled them, because predictable people are manageable. Unreadable people are expensive to misjudge. You learn to let pauses stretch just a second longer than comfortable, to respond slower than expected, to let silence sit in the air until it started working for you. You watched how fast people exposed themselves when they thought the quiet was a mistake. It never was. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was filtration. Only the confident could sit with it. Only the secure could tolerate it. Everyone else filled it with excuses, jokes, justifications, explanations you never asked for. And in that flood of unnecessary words, you saw exactly who they were. Silence made you observant. Observation made you surgical. You stopped reacting to energy and started reading patterns. You noticed who spoke when nervous, who over-explained when guilty, who went loud when insecure, who tried to dominate space when they felt small. And you realized something chilling. You weren't in the same conversation anymore. They were still talking to be seen. You were listening to decide. That's why the room shifts when you go quiet. That's why it feels heavier, denser, charged. People sense when someone has crossed from emotional participation into strategic awareness, from expression into evaluation, from needing approval into selecting outcomes. That's not charisma. That's authority without ceremony. You're not cold. You're controlled. You're not detached. You're deliberate. You're not silent because you have nothing to say. You're silent because everything you say now moves weight. You learned the cost of words, how one sentence can trigger resistance, expose intent, collapse optionality. So you started speaking only when the return justified the risk. You started letting action do the talking. You started understanding that restraint multiplies impact. This is where unpredictability becomes power, not chaos, not impulse, but selective disclosure. They don't know what you're thinking, so they start assuming you're thinking farther ahead than you are. They don't know what you're planning, so they start bracing for possibilities that exhaust them before you ever move. You let them, because while they're burning energy speculating, you're conserving it. While they're trying to decode you, you're refining yourself. While they're reacting to imagined threats, you're aligning timing. You stopped needing to win arguments. You started winning positions. That's the evolution. That's the shift. That's the moment where silence stops being passive and becomes directional. Where not responding isn't avoidance, it's command. Where calm isn't softness, it's compression. You're not absent from the room when you go quiet. You become the center of gravity. Everything starts orbiting your stillness. Decisions stall. Conversations derail. People wait for cues you never promised to give. And the longer you let that happen, the clearer it becomes. You're no longer playing their tempo. You're setting your own. Wait. Don't answer yet. Just look around the room in your head. Feel that shift? That sudden tightening in the air? That moment when half the people stopped breathing because something about you didn't fit the script they memorized? Good. That's where this starts. Because the panic didn't come from noise. It didn't come from force. It came from recognition. They saw you do something they couldn't name. They heard you say something that didn't come from books, didn't come from mentors, didn't come from polite society's little training manuals. And the first thought that ripped through their minds wasn't admiration. It was fear. Wait, who taught you this? That question isn't curiosity, it's an alarm. You need to understand something right now. People only ask that when they realize you're operating from a place they don't have access to. When your instincts move faster than their rules. When your calm doesn't come from safety, but from familiarity with chaos. See, most of them were trained in the light. They learned how to behave when conditions are clean, when approval is guaranteed, when outcomes are predictable. You were educated in the dark. Pain was your instructor. Silence was your classroom. Betrayal was the exam you passed without studying. That's why when pressure hits, you don't fracture. You clarify. They're panicking because they can't trace your source. There's no lineage they can mock, no mentor they can discredit, no system they can point at and say, "Ah, that's where it came from." You didn't inherit this. You forged it. And that terrifies people who survive by imitation. You carry that dangerous duality they can't resolve. You look controlled, but there's violence in your restraint. You sound reasonable, but there's fire behind every pause. You move like a saint, but think like a psychopath who learned mercy the hard way. Angel and demon, not at war inside you, but aligned. That's the part they don't teach. That's the part that doesn't come with certificates. They sense it when you speak. Your words don't beg. They don't posture. They land. And suddenly the room splits, half leaning in, half pulling back, half inspired, half scrambling to protect whatever fragile hierarchy they were standing on. Because you're unpredictable in the most threatening way possible. Not erratic, unreadable. Unpredictability isn't chaos when it's disciplined. It's leverage. It's the ability to step outside expectation and make everyone else react while you remain still. They can't model you. They can't simulate you. Every time they think they've figured you out, you switch gears without changing speed. That kind of power only comes from pain that didn't kill you. You learned when no one was watching. You adapted when no one was helping. You sharpened instincts in moments where hesitation would have ended you. So when they ask, "Who taught you this?" what they're really asking is, "Why didn't this break you like it broke us?" And the answer makes them sick. Because you didn't become this by being protected. You became this by being tested. You didn't get softer. You got precise. You didn't lose empathy. You just stopped wasting it on people who confuse kindness with weakness. You didn't abandon the light. You just learned how to carry it through hell without flinching. That's why your presence rewires rooms. You don't need to dominate. You don't need to raise your voice. Your calm alone tells a story they don't want to hear. That you've already been through the worst-case scenario and survived with awareness intact. They feel exposed around you because masks slip when real experience walks in. Half the room panics because you remind them of something they buried, the version of themselves that could have evolved if they hadn't chosen comfort over truth. The other half watches in silence because on some level they know whatever shaped you wasn't pretty, but it was effective. And here's the part they'll never admit out loud. They're afraid you didn't learn this from someone. They're afraid you remembered it, like it was always in you, like the pain didn't create you. It unlocked you. So let them panic, let them whisper, let them look for a teacher, a source, a reason that makes you safe to understand. You don't owe them an explanation. You are what happens when pressure meets awareness, when darkness is studied instead of denied, when survival evolves into mastery. And the next time that question echoes, "Wait, who taught you this?" just smile internally, because the truth would destroy the room completely. No one taught you. You became this when you realized breaking wasn't an option, and unpredictability was the only honest response to a world that never played fair. And here's the part they really don't want to sit with, the part where the panic deepens instead of fading. Because once that question is asked, once the room fractures and the energy shifts, it never goes back to normal. They can feel it. Something irreversible just happened. A line was crossed, not by aggression, but by presence. They're realizing you don't react the way a normal person should. When tension rises, most people scramble for approval or retreat into silence. You don't. You slow down, your eyes sharpen, your words get fewer, heavier. You're not overwhelmed, you're activated. And that flips a switch in their nervous system they don't understand. They were taught to fear confrontation. You were trained by it. They were conditioned to avoid discomfort. You learned to read it like a language. That's why they can't tell if you're about to save the room or burn it down. And that uncertainty is poison to people who survive on predictability. See, they grew up believing morality was simple. Good people do this, bad people do that. Light stays clean, dark stays hidden. Then you walked in, composed, articulate, grounded, carrying both without apology. You didn't choose a side, you integrated them. That's when the saint psychopath paradox hits them hardest. Because you don't look cruel, yet you're not afraid to be. You don't look broken, yet you've clearly been shattered before. You don't look angry, yet there's a lethal calm in how you assess everything. They can sense it. You know exactly how far things can go because you've already been there. You've stared at outcomes they only theorize about in safe conversations. You've lived inside consequences, not fantasies. And that's why their bodies react before their minds catch up. Heart rates spike. Breathing shortens, eyes dart. Half the room panics not because you're loud, but because you're quiet at the wrong moments. Silence is terrifying when it's controlled. They start replaying interactions with you, looking for tells. They search your tone, your posture, your pauses, trying to reverse engineer you. And every attempt fails, because your behavior isn't performative, It's instinctual. You're not following a script. You're responding to reality as it is, not as it's supposed to be. That's when the second realization hits them. You're not impressed by status. You're not intimidated by authority. You're not distracted by surface-level charm. Those things only work on people who haven't lost much. You've already paid the price, which means you're no longer negotiable. They can't leverage you with fear, because fear taught you. They can't manipulate you with praise, because you've survived without it. They can't corner you with threats, because you've already adapted to worst-case scenarios. So they panic, because people who can't be moved move everything else. You've become a mirror they didn't consent to look into. Standing near you forces them to confront their own softness, their own avoidance, their own untested beliefs. And that's unbearable for people who built their identity on never being pushed too far. You didn't just learn how to survive pain. You learned how to extract intelligence from it. Every loss refined you. Every betrayal sharpened your perception. Every silent night trained your nervous system to stay awake while others shut down. That's why when chaos enters the room, you don't escalate, you calculate. They mistake that for coldness. It's actually mercy, because you know exactly how destructive you could be if you stopped caring. That's the demon they sense. Not unleashed, but disciplined. Chained not by fear, but by choice. And nothing scares people more than power that restrains itself voluntarily. They're used to monsters who snarl. You're worse. You think. And the angel side of you. That's what confuses them most. Because despite everything, you still see clearly. You still understand nuance. You still recognize suffering in others, even when you refuse to be consumed by it. You're not numb. You're selective. You don't waste compassion on people who weaponize it. You don't extend trust to those who haven't earned proximity. You don't explain yourself to anyone who hasn't walked your terrain. That's not arrogance, that's evolution. So when the room fractures and that question hangs in the air, wait, who taught you this? Understand this. They're witnessing the aftermath of pressure done right, of a mind that didn't collapse under contradiction, but fused it into something lethal and lucid. You are the result of lessons no one volunteers for. You are what happens when survival upgrades into strategy. You are living proof that pain, when metabolized properly, becomes authority. Let them panic. Let them whisper. Let them look for your origin story so they can box you into something manageable. They won't find it. Because you weren't trained to perform. You were forged to end cycles. And once people sense that, the room is never calm again. And here's where it goes deeper, darker, quieter. Because after the panic, after the whispers, after they fail to categorize you, something more unsettling takes over the room. Awareness. They start realizing you're not reacting to them. You're watching them. Not in a paranoid way, in a surgical way. You clock micro-expressions. You feel energy shifts before words move. You notice who stiffens when you speak, who avoids your eyes, who suddenly over-explains. You're not hunting, you're mapping. That's when the power dynamic truly flips. Because most people believe observation is passive. They don't understand that being seen, truly seen, is invasive. You learned this early, when you had to read rooms to survive, when moods mattered more than words, when silence was louder than threats. You learned how to sense danger without drama, intention without confession. That's not talent, that's adaptation. And now, that adaptation walks into rooms before you do. They start editing themselves around you. They speak differently, They posture less. They hesitate before lying. Half the room panics because they feel naked. The other half panics because they realize you could dismantle them without raising your voice. And you're choosing not to. That choice is unbearable to witness because restraint implies capability. You see, people are comfortable with obvious threats, loud anger, messy egos, predictable villains. What they can't stand is quiet capability. Someone who could disrupt everything, but doesn't need to prove it. That's you. You don't flex. You don't posture. You let others reveal themselves. That's why they ask again and again in different forms, who taught you this? They're begging for a narrative that makes you less dangerous. Because if this was taught, it can be unlearned. If it was inherited, it can be dismissed. If it came from trauma, it can be pitied. But if it came from integration, from a mind that survived contradiction and became sharper because of it, then you're not broken, you're upgraded, and that terrifies them. Because you represent a version of evolution that doesn't need permission. You didn't choose between kindness and strength. You didn't choose between empathy and control. You didn't choose between light and dark. You stacked them. That's why your presence destabilizes fragile systems. Systems rely on predictability, on people staying in their assigned emotional lanes. You don't. You move fluidly. Calm when chaos is expected, silent when reactions are demanded, direct when avoidance is safer. You violate expectation without breaking composure. That's dominance without aggression. They feel it when you don't rush to explain yourself, when you let misunderstandings breathe, when you don't correct people immediately. That patience isn't insecurity. It's confidence that truth will surface on its own. Because it always does. You've watched it happen too many times. You've seen liars collapse under the weight of their own stories. You've seen manipulators overplay their hand. You've seen golden reputations rot when pressure lasted longer than their mask. That's why when someone powerful stumbles in front of you, when the room feels that shift, you don't celebrate, you don't gloat, you don't flinch. You've seen this movie before. And that's when the panic becomes personal. Because they're realizing you didn't just learn how to survive chaos. You learned how to outlast narratives. You don't attach to roles. You don't cling to identity labels. You let people show you who they are over time, and you adjust accordingly. Time is your weapon. Patience is your camouflage. Silence is your pressure. They mistake your stillness for passivity until they realize outcomes keep bending around you. That's the demon they can't control. Not rage, not cruelty, but clarity. And the angel? That's the part of you that refuses to become small just to make others comfortable. That part that still believes in precision over destruction. That part that chooses restraint not because you're afraid, but because you understand consequences. You don't need to burn the room down. Just standing there, fully integrated, is enough. So when the energy spikes, when half the room panics, and the other half goes quiet, when someone finally blurts out that question again, wait, who taught you this? Understand what's really happening. They're not asking about your past. They're afraid of your future. They're sensing that whatever you are now is only a phase, a controlled one, that something sharper is waiting behind it, something even calmer, even more decisive, even less interested in approval. And they don't know if they'll survive the version of you that stops explaining. You do. That's why you don't rush. That's why you don't react. That's why you let the panic breathe. Because you already know the truth they're dancing around. You weren't taught this to fit in. You were forged like this to change the temperature of every room you enter, without ever raising your voice, and once people feel that, they never forget you. And here's where it ends. Not with noise, not with theatrics, but with something far more unsettling. Acceptance. You don't correct them anymore. You don't soften yourself. You don't rush to make the room comfortable again. You let the panic sit. Because you understand something they're just beginning to feel. Once awareness enters a space, it doesn't leave quietly. It rewires behavior. It exposes cracks. It forces choices. They'll either grow or avoid you forever. And you're fine with both. You've stopped needing to be understood. You've stopped explaining your depth to people who only swim in the shallow end. You've stopped shrinking the parts of you that were carved by fire. That question, wait, who taught you this? Fades into silence, replaced by something heavier, respect, distance, caution. Because now they know. You're not dangerous because you're loud. You're dangerous because you're awake. You carry light without innocence, darkness without chaos, power without desperation, and the room will never forget the moment it realized you weren't reacting to the game. You were operating above it. That's why you walk away unchanged. That's why they're still shaken, and that's why, deep down, they know. Whatever made you like this wasn't an accident. It was necessary, and it's finished teaching you now. No, it's not finished yet. That's the part they keep misunderstanding. They think this is the final form because the room quieted, because the panic settled into caution, because people stopped asking questions out loud and started asking them in private. They mistake stillness for completion. But you know better. You know this phase, this calm, watchful, controlled version of you is just the threshold, the moment right before momentum compounds, the inhale before something irreversible. Because awareness doesn't plateau, it sharpens. What they felt wasn't the full weight of you, it was the preview, a signal flare. Enough to destabilize the room, not enough to collapse it. And you did that without trying, without force, without strategy, without revealing anything you didn't intend to. That's why the silence afterward feels heavier than the panic before it. They go home replaying moments, your pauses, your timing, the way you didn't rush to speak when everyone expected you to, the way you let others talk themselves into corners, the way you stayed emotionally neutral while outcomes tilted in your favor. They can't sleep comfortably after that. Because once someone like you enters their awareness, they start questioning the foundation they've been standing on. They wonder how many people like you exist, how many learned in the dark instead of the spotlight, how many are quiet not because they're weak, but because they're deciding, and you feel it too. You feel the shift in yourself. You're no longer trying to prove resilience. You're no longer fueled by survival. You're no longer reactive to disrespect or doubt. Those were earlier lessons. Now you're operating from discernment. You choose when to engage. You choose when to remain silent. You choose which battles are beneath you and which ones are worth rewriting entire trajectories for. That's evolution through pain. Not turning bitter, not turning cruel, but turning precise. You see how easily rooms fall apart when certainty walks in quietly. How fragile bravado becomes when it's no longer being mirrored back. How quickly people reveal fear when someone stops playing emotional ping pong with them. You're not here to dominate spaces. You're here to change the rules by existing inside them differently. And that's why the panic happened. Because half the room realized they couldn't control you. The other half realized they couldn't ignore you. And both outcomes lead to the same conclusion. You're no longer adjustable. You're not malleable. You're not impressionable. You're not available for manipulation. You've crossed that internal line where discomfort no longer scares you. It informs you. So let them keep asking in whispers who taught you this. Let them keep searching for a source they can discredit. Let them keep trying to reverse engineer a mind that was built under conditions they would have folded in. You don't need to answer, because the truth is already doing the talking. You're calm where others scramble, clear where others cope, still where others react. And the next time a room tightens when you speak, when that familiar panic ripples and someone almost blurts it out again, you'll recognize the moment, instantly. Not as validation, not as victory, but as confirmation. Confirmation that you've outgrown explanation. Confirmation that your presence alone now carries weight. Confirmation that whatever shaped you didn't just teach you how to survive. It taught you how to arrive. And this time, you're not here to blend in. You're here to make people feel the difference and never forget it.